Dear friends, dear colleagues, first of all, it's a great honor to receive this John Goldman Award today, and it's a lot of emotion for me, and I'm really grateful to the International CML Foundation and the people in the International Foundation who decided that I would deserve this award. I would also like to thank Professor François Guillot, my presenter today, who was the founding president on the French CML group in 2000 and the first physician in our country to have access to STI 571 and thus to save and treat our CML patients differently as before. I didn't have the chance to work at the Hammersmith Hospital, but I had the chance to meet Professor John Goldman at the beginning in 2001, my first ASH Congress, and then in 2003 in Rapallo at the European School of Hematology. And I was always impressed by his capacity to synthesize difficult concepts and explain this to us and to spread his knowledge and to his kindness. Before I will start into depth into my talk, I will tell you a little bit about how I came to treat CML patients. It was not a straightforward career, so I hope that for the young generation who still don't know and don't have precise plan, this will give hope. Anything can happen if you want it and if you meet the right people. So I trained in hematology in Paris, and you see here my first paper, who was published in 1994. It was about chronic, what we thought was chronic neutrophilic leukemia. And there were a couple of years between the time I wrote it and the time it was published, because at that time we needed to make a proof that it was not CML, and we needed to have the molecular tools to show that there was no atypical BCR-able transcript. And this took several years to have this tool. Right now, in a few hours, you have a GeneXpert answer of whether or not there's a major transcript. So meanwhile, I kept on with my training, and I was interested in the pathophysiology of the diseases. That's why I came to have a training in science. And in fact, I started with the pathophysiology of patients who had HIV-related lymphoma and the implication of the Epstein-Barr virus in these lymphomas, so not at all in chronic phase CML. And when I finished my training in hematology, I went on with my training in science, as Professor Guillot mentioned, first at Princeton University, and then more into depth into cancer immunology and vaccines. And I had a great time there. I can see on the right side, my friends pictured me as a cat having great fun, great friends, great science, great paper. This was really a happy life. But then at the end of the year 2000, a friend of mine called me, it was at Paris Saint-Louis Hospital, and he said, we need a hematologist urgently. So please, can you give you the answer within 2 weeks? So I said immediately yes, and this is the goodbye, one of the goodbye drawing that I got from my friends and my technician. At the beginning, as a young hematologist, I had to treat patients with acute leukemia inpatients, not at all CML, but I wanted to bridge my scientific background together with my hematological background. And of course, CML was one of the most immune-sensitive hematological malignancies, as you can maybe see from these very old papers of allogeneic stem cell transplantation, with the patients receiving syngeneic or T-cell depleted transplant relapsing in 50% of the cases, while those who had acute or chronic GVHD, so with a GVL effect, hardly relapsing. But then my boss told me, well, we don't care anymore about immune therapy in hematological malignancies because there's a revolution ongoing. You're not aware of that? This was STI 571, and here are the recommendations from John Goldman and Brian Drucker in 2000-2001. Start with the drug, and if it works, continue, and if it doesn't, transplant the patient. So I asked myself, is there still a role for other approaches, and including immunotherapeutic approaches to treat CML? And as you can see here, we know that there are still many patients who failed imatinib, and thanks to our biologists and our scientists, we understand a little bit more about the biological diversity underlying clinical outcomes, primary and secondary resistance mechanisms to TKI, and we have great tools to clinical practice in order to make our treatment choices. Nevertheless, as you can see, most of the patients at that time had to continue the TKI because Tessa Holyoake and collaborators and other groups showed that quiescent leukemic stem cells were not sensitive to ATP-competitive tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And this is really an issue. There was no cure. And the third thing is that if you can compare the activity of donor lymphocyte infusion as compared to that of imatinib in patients who relapsed after transplantation, well, immunotherapy was much, much more efficient than imatinib. So there is still some room, in my opinion, for immunotherapy in CML, and it's not only about allogeneic responses against leukemia. There were also some endogenous responses. Of course, BCR-ABL could be itself a neoantigen at the junction, but Agnes Young and colleagues and many others showed that there were also endogenous antigens like proteinase 3, WT1, and PRAME, and that the expression pattern of these antigens differed according to the differentiation of CD34 cells and also according to the CML phase. It was not only about antigens, but it was that the patients were able to mount CD8 cytotoxic responses against this antigen. And you see here the proteinase 3 specific CTLs in interferon-treated patients on the left. The interferon-sensitive patients did mount these responses while the resistant did not. The patients treated with allogeneic stem cell transplantation also had this protection, while the patients treated with imatinib did not. So I was allowed to work on CML, first of all in the lab, not on the patient, and we decided to look at whether vaccination with dendritic cells, autologous dendritic cells, would be interested and would be functional as candidate vaccine. So we made dendritic cells from monocytes, and the interest of these cells is that they did express BCR-ABL plus the other tumor antigens, so no need to load with external antigens. And we published that BCR-ABL-derived DC could differentiate as normal DC, and they were functional. The thing is that BCR-ABL expression decreased during DC differentiation, and the problem for vaccination is that at diagnosis, the immune milieu was immune suppressive, and we found a steep decrease in myeloid and plasmacytoid blood DC at diagnosis, partly because of the immunosuppressive milieu, especially VEGS. NK cells were also altered since leukemic cells express the MIC-A and release soluble MIC, thereby decreasing the activating receptor NKG2T on NK cells. Thus, we could eventually use these cells to vaccinate the patients, but first of all, induce a response on imatinib to get rid of the immunosuppression, and then use the cells to vaccinate and maintain or stop the treatment. But again, at that time, we understood better why imatinib failed, and there were an expanding arsenal of TKI, and we all know that today we have first generation, second generation, third generation ATP competitive non-selective TKI plus the allosteric, so the vaccination program was dropped. It was dropped, but where are we today? We have many recommendations starting from 2006, the ELN recommendation led by Professor Bakkarani, until the last ones led by Professor Apole in 2025 in order to guide us on how to use this treatment and how to treat. And I'm very grateful for them to be included in the group. And let's look at how it looks like today thanks to these drugs. We start with any approved TKI, and either we get a response or not, which means that we didn't manage to eradicate completely resistance, although it's at a lower level than with imatinib alone. Fortunately, TFR entered into the story, so not all patients are going to continue the treatment lifelong, but there are still a bunch of them who are going to do so. And the problem with these new drugs, the ATP second generation and third generation, is that we increase the intolerance. And then, in fact, with these new drugs, including imatinib, we have a lot of challenges: the safety, the tolerance, and the quality of life. And some consider that imatinib is the best tolerated drug as compared to second and third generation TKI. But in fact, when you look already at this publication from 2007, so the early stages of imatinib, we knew already that there were many adverse events which were altering the quality of life of the patient. And this publication for Blood 2025, you see that long-term adverse drug reactions on imatinib are quite frequent, with an incidence of 76% at 8 years. So no, it's not a perfect drug. We also have huge challenges with second and third generation non-selective ATP competitive TKI. You know all of them, with the gastrointestinal toxicity of bosutinib, the liver, the kidney, with dasatinib, the lung, the disimmunity, with nilotinib, the glucose metabolism and the ischemic CVD, and with ponatinib, hypertension, ischemic events, and myocardial failure. And this is really a problem. It's not only a problem for the patient and for the doctors. We have to deal with either acute or chronic problem, leading to sometimes permanent disability and altering the quality of life. But it's also a challenge for our healthcare systems and our society. Are we going to transform a fatal disease into a chronic cancer and be satisfied of this situation? Increasing in the multimorbidity prevalence, decreasing the median age of multimorbidity onset, and this has a strong economic burden on our healthcare system. So no, we are not satisfied with the situation. And so first of all, we need to deal with this. What we started to do, and the example here is given what we did in order to prevent nilotinib-associated cardiovascular impact in the past. The first step was to recognize unusual situation, and that was not very easy with nilotinib because the background population already presents ischemic events. And fortunately, together with a few physicians who also had a warning sign in their head, Philippe Lecoutre, Elisabetta Abruzzese, and Peter Valent, we sent a warning sign in 2011. And we needed, of course, to confirm the TKI effect above the risk of the background population, and that's what we did here with a patient evaluated before nilotinib and short after nilotinib treatment with the lesions that you see here without any cardiovascular risk factors. Once this risk was recognized and admitted by the community, we needed first to cooperate with other specialists in order to figure out how to better handle these patients. And the French group, but many groups have shown that this impact of nilotinib was also dependent on the patient comorbidity, the one with a very high or high cardiovascular risk being the most at risk of developing problems with nilotinib. And that led to the recommendations in many countries in order to better to mitigate the risk. Recognizing the risk factors, as I said, of course, the background of the patient, but also as demonstrated in NSND, the dose of the medication and the duration of exposure to the drug. So knowing all of this, we were able to elaborate some risk management plan. And the 4 pillars of the plan are the avoidance strategy in high-risk patients, the early detection and primary prevention, the switch in case of an ischemic event, and the response-based dose reduction. And we needed, of course, to evaluate our management plan. And that's what we started to do within the French group towards an improved safety, quality of life, and relief of the burden of the treatment. The approach in 2007 presented at ASH was the molecular response-based dose reduction of TKI, and it was nilotinib. In patients who had reached a major molecular response, either on first or second line, on 600 or 800 milligram daily, we decreased the dose once MMR was achieved down to 450 or 300, and we demonstrated that patients rarely lost MMR. We could even go to more dose decrease later on, and eventually lead some patients to treatment-free remission with a TFR rate of 70%. And that's what our proposal for a new CML management for clinical practice, once the patient obtains a confirmed MMR, go down to the lowest dose level. And we now know, and I'm very happy about that it's an expanding approach with many trials testing this strategy with other tyrosine kinase inhibitor. I have to say that the patients had an improved quality of life with less dryness of skin, decrease in body hair loss, and we didn't have any ischemic event. But this strategy could not be done without our molecular biologist and our hematology lab, because these rely on and I would like to underline the importance of a reliable MRD monitoring, cooperation with biologists, and of course the patient trust. And in fact, these lower dose prescription in the post-marketing setting are very frequent. And this is, I invite you to read this very interesting work comparing the dose and dosage regimen determination during drug development and the dose and regimen after trial. And in fact, most of the patients after a study requires dose reduction because as a physician, we try to seek the perfect balance between an efficacy and a tolerability on an individual basis. And thus, very frequently, approved dosage are not optimal and frequent, and there are frequent changes of the approved dose. So we, as a community and as doctors, we must emphasize on the fact that there is the clinical evidence is not reflected in the packaged insert, and we should work as a group so that there would be a re-examination of the optimal dosage and the regimen. It absolutely needed the importance of the real-world data in order to try to have the package inserts modified. But now we may enter a new therapeutic era where we may not have to take care of all of these deleterious off-target effects because we know we can have much more selective TKI, and this increase in selectivity is likely to translate into a better tolerability. The ATP competitive TKI under development, the allosteric TKI, and asciminib, which is already marketed, and the other one, TERN and Tigrex, under development, and some PROTAC. I wrote here allosteric PROTAC. I'm not sure that the ATP competitive PROTAC might be selective, but Mike Deininger can tell something about it. So, of course, asciminib, formerly named ABL001, is at the forefront of the selective BCR-ABL inhibition. And for sure, we are absolutely sure that this drug now really improves the safety and also the health-related quality of life of our patient, and much more than the ATP competitive inhibitor non-selective that we have right now. We also know that it has a high level of efficacy, but we need subgroup analysis, and impact of prognostic factors on different risk subgroups are absolutely needed in order to know which patients would most benefit from this drug. It's also able to overcoming resistance to ATP competitive inhibitor to some extent, but it's not a perfect drug. We know that cross-resistance does exist. Whether it's going to be useful as combination therapy, at least in high-risk group patients, we don't know. It needs to be explored, although we know that we combine these drugs with other ATP competitive inhibitors. Is it going to be useful in blast crisis patients for which the overall survival is not more than 30%? It's under investigation also. And whether this drug will have an improved access to TFR remains to be demonstrated. It's unknown right now, because our ultimate goal is not to treat patients for lifelong. Our ultimate goal as physicians is to cure the patients. And in 2011, I got an email from Professor John Goldman asking me to write a review about curing chronic myeloid leukemia, and it was a great emotion for me. I show you on the left-hand side the protocol that we wrote that led to the STEAM study together with François-Xavier Marron, and this review of Tim Hughes about pioneering TFR study in which I had the honor to participate. And right now, TFR has been integrated as a standard laboratory and clinical practice. But there are many hurdles in curing CML. The therapeutic modalities are not well enough adapted to the underlying heterogeneity of the disease and to the disease dynamics. We have a difficulty to decrease the leukemic burden between below the MR2 or 3 threshold in the majority of the patients, especially in the youngest patient population. We have a persistence of LSC even in deep molecular responders. Is it a time bomb or is it insignificant? And we don't understand perfectly why patients relapse and when others do not relapse after treatment discontinuation. So we went back in the lab in the STEAM study to look at immune parameters in the STEAM trial, and we had the honor to have a best clinical abstract by Jorge Cortes, who organized the ICMLF 2016 in Houston, and the participation of the French patient with LMC France, the association who raised funds for this project. But Satu explained to you very brilliantly and much more than what I can do right now, the importance of the immune system and the NK cells in the control of CML, especially in the TFR setting. So we are desperately seeking for an immunotherapeutic benefit, and this is an intriguing case of a patient who had CML at the age of 73, who got an MMR and an MR4, and at the age of 76, I had cytopenia, unexplained cytopenia occurred, and I diagnosed hairy cell leukemia. So the opportunity here to combine imatinib and interferon was perfect. And this patient within 6 months obtained an undetectable residual disease and is now 1 year in TFR, both for hairy cell leukemia and for CML. So there has been a lot of interferon TKI trials. Here is the saga, and forgive me if I forgot some studies combining PEG interferon with imatinib, nilotinib, or dasatinib. And in the very nice Australian trial and the Nordic group, it has been shown that the adjunction of interferon increased NK activating receptors, increased leukemic antigen-specific CTLs, provides co-stimulation to T cell, and induced terminal maturation of cytotoxic NK cell. Is it related to a better clinical outcome? It's true that we see increased MMR and DMR rates. The problem is that we see also an increased toxicity, and currently we are not able to have a clear TFR benefit, and we don't understand why. So I'll finish on the road to cure towards modern approaches of care. We have to recognize that despite a unique oncogene, this is a heterogeneous disease, and we can't treat all patients with the same drug. We need to better understand the biological heterogeneity of the disease, and that's why also we are here together to translate the knowledge that the scientists and the biologists are providing to us into the lab tools and into the clinical practice. We need to be aware of what patients do experience, because we learn a lot from the patients, and this helps us to optimize the treatment that we currently have, and of course, to continuously educate ourselves and also to spread the knowledge. And I don't know in the future who will need simple or dual BCR-ABL inhibition, who will need BCR-ABL inhibition plus targeting alternative pathway, bone marrow niche modulator, immune killing or PROTAC, BCR-ABL destruction. But to finish with the immune system, I would like to remind you that PROTAC, it means proteasome, and what's the role of proteasome in the cell? It's to chop proteins into peptide for MHC class 1 presentation. So PROTAC might be able to kill LSC twice on one shot, once for BCR-ABL description, and the second one with an off-target immune killing. With that, I would like to acknowledge, of course, the team in my hospital and in my research unit. Not everyone is on the picture here. And the patients, of course, that I symbolize here by the French Association of Patients, LMC France. I would like also to, I'm very grateful to the French CML group and also to the French molecular biology group for hematological malignancies, without whom we would not treat the patients we do not right now. And also to thank all friends and our colleagues all over the world. If you're not on the picture, please send it to me by email. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Delphine. I think we have 5 minutes for discussion. Question from the audience. Delphine, you discuss again the question of the immune system that are part of the problem. Do you think that we could manage our patients with more than one drug? Is it realistic to use only one drug for this very aggressive disease?
As I mentioned, it's one CML, but there are many different subclones, and we know that there are many different clinical outcomes. It goes from TFR to blast crisis, and in the middle there are suboptimal responders, those are going to get a deep molecular response but are going to relapse. And this clinical heterogeneity means something for the biology. If we manage to understand the biology behind it and translate it into how we could treat the different situations, then I think we will make a big progress in curing the patients. But right now, we do with what we have. So indeed, we have the tendency to choose a treatment according to the LCS risk or to the new markers like ASXL1 abnormalities and also to the comorbidity profile. But we need really to go one step above this and in order to make significant progress in the future.
Thank you. Professor Hellmann.
I think, Delphine, you reported on an important period in CML development and in cure development, I would say. And this happily coincided with your professional career. And I think you made that nicely clear, and I'd just like to congratulate you on this.